Welcome back, everyone, to this next session on corporate business models for 100% renewable energy. We have a great panel of industry experts for this conversation, so I'm really interested to hear what everyone has to say, and also your comments during the Q&A. If you do have questions for the panelists, please type them into the chat area there. There's a little bubble there on the upper right-hand screen that opens the chat box. Type your questions in there, and Ross, the chairperson, will queue them up for discussion during Q&A. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our chair for this session, Mr. Ross Malme, who is Senior Advisor at Bowen Advisors. Ross joined Bowen Advisors in November 2019 and serves as a Senior Advisor to the firm. Based in Atlanta, he has 30 years of experience as an executive and entrepreneur in the energy technology space, and is an internationally recognized expert in international energy markets and emerging energy technologies. He is credited as the inventor of the first and most successful utility automatic meter reading system in the industry, which was the standard of the utility industry in North America for over 25 years. He is also the founder of one of the first electricity demand response companies in North America, and put much of the IT and application infrastructure in electricity markets in place on the East Coast for retail electricity customers to participate in wholesale electricity demand response markets. So without further ado, Ross, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you everybody for joining. A couple of housekeeping things. Again, if you have any questions for the panel, please type them into the chat box. There's that little circle up in the upper right. If you are not presenting, if you could mute your phone or mute your mic, excuse me, and have your camera off, that would be great. Again, I'm with Bowen Advisors, and if you're not familiar with us, we are a growth capital investment bank, which means we are some of the folks that provide capital raising resources and liquidity for technology companies across many sectors. So we provide basically three services. We provide sell-side M&A. If you're looking to look for a liquidity event in your company, we provide buy-side M&A for larger companies that are looking for inorganic growth. And we provide capital raising services for growth capital for companies across 5 sectors. Energy technology is one of them. I co-manage the energy tech practice for the firm. We also bank IoT and cloud, defense tech, healthcare tech, and consumer tech. This particular panel, I think you're going to find really interesting, building to a great extent on what you heard this morning. Each of the presenters is going to give you a little bit of a unique perspective on how to do it, so to speak, from a corporate procurement model for renewable energy. You know, I saw an article just this morning on Utility Dive. I'm not sure if any of you, the rest of you saw this. It was about NextEra's plans for renewable energy in the next through 2024, I believe. And they have plans to build up to 30 gigawatts of renewable energy. 30 gigawatts. Now, if you think about that scale, that's bigger than the peak demand of New York State. It's about half the demand of California, and maybe about 40% of what Texas would be. And they've stated in there that a lot of this is going to be going into the C&I sector. So it's actually the sector we're talking about right here. It's not just big utility scale projects, and you'll hear some more about that today. And the thing that's so interesting about this for me is you take a look at the massive rotation of capital that's going on from the oil and gas sector into clean tech and into renewables. We now have at least 3 major oil companies that have committed to net zero by a date certain. That's Shell, BP, and Total. And by last count, I think we've got something like 30 major electric utilities have also committed to net zero by a date certain. And I'm sure PKD, you'll talk a little bit about that. But this is all being driven, kind of by what we call the 3 Ds. And you probably heard these before, but it's decarbonization, decentralization, and digitization of the grid. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Peter Kelly-Detwiler. He's the co-founder of NorthBridge Energy Partners and more than 25 years of experience in the energy industry. Peter has focused on development of retail markets, new trends, technologies. He was VP of Energy Technology at Constellation New Energy, where he managed their demand response business. PKD and I actually were competitors at one point in time. If you haven't seen this, he produces a weekly video. It's about a 3 to 5 minute video, I believe, Peter. That's the biggest news in the energy in the industry. And if you just have 3 minutes to go catch up what's going on, I really encourage you to watch this video. I'm sure PKD will talk about that. And then we'll probably also talk about your upcoming book release, the Energy Switch, which I believe is available now on Amazon and be released on June 15th. Without further ado, PKD.
Thank you, Ross. Yeah, Ross and I were back in, I think we met back in the mid 2000s. We were doing DR. We were country before country was cool. And now obviously, with FERC Order 2222 and all these demand response companies, we've kind of finally grown into the britches we sewed for ourselves a long, long time ago. So what I'm going to be talking about today are some of the trends to consider. If you're a large buyer, you're looking at the space. Clearly, the whole green purchasing piece of the equation is picking up, but there are some issues to be thoughtful about. And it's worth noting that BNE, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, their report just came out this week that indicated that global corporate purchases were up 18% year over year, despite COVID, up now to 23.7 gigawatts globally. What's really interesting about this trend, though, is US, for the first time, saw a negative trend. We dropped from 14.1 gigs purchased in 2019 to 11.9 gigawatts in 2020. The good news means the rest of the world is starting to pick up the cudgel and move forward with this thing. And the trend overall is quite positive. And one of the hats I wear as a consultant, I do a lot of strategic consulting. I read 3 to 4 hours a day and focus on, I have 22 different newsletters, so I'm digesting information from around the planet, trying to figure out where this is all going. Hydrogen, blockchain, latest battery technologies, what's happening with solar efficiencies, and so on and so forth, and how all these technologies, business models, financial flows are conspiring to create the future that we're already living in, and why it's accelerating. What I'm going to talk about today, in that thing that I do as Director of Educational Programs for Smart Energy Decisions, I'm involved with a lot of corporate buyers in workshops and conversations and so on. It's really clear that the buyers and all the way now through the C-suite feel this mandate to decarbonize. Many of you might have seen Larry Fink's letter from BlackRock the other day. He's got what, $7.8 trillion, not a lot of money, under management, assets under management, and basically put everybody on notice in the corporate world saying you will disclose your risk related to your exposure to carbon. And then Moody's yesterday downgraded a couple of large oil and gas companies based on their exposure to hydrocarbons. So it's really clear that the whole world is shifting in this direction and has to get to this 1.5 degree target. We probably won't. We'll probably end up at 2 or worse, but nonetheless. So you're all facing this pressure, this decarbonization thing. You can't argue with atmospheric science. At the same time, what's happening is, if we can move to the next slide, the pace of change and the risk of getting it wrong has never been higher. I've written about 300 pieces for Forbes, and one of them was with the CEO of Hennon Armstrong, Jeff Van Eck, and he said to me, this is the greatest opportunity in the history of humanity to either make money or incinerate capital. And this picture right here that you're looking at, I took April 2 years ago from a ferry. And what you're looking at here are the remnants of 2 500-foot cooling towers costing $570 million that were erected by Dominion under pressure from the EPA because they were sucking 1 billion gallons of water out of the bay each day for once through cooling. And it was killing all the larvae in Mount Hope Bay. So the EPA said, thou shalt manage this issue. So they used a whole bunch of technology, including Chinese technology, built the biggest cooling towers the planet had seen, $570 million. They were in service, Dominion owned them for 5 years. That was it. Then the 1600 megawatt Brayton Point coal plant was shut down because natural gas from fracking became cheaper because of the technology. And so what happened was Dominion sold this 307-acre plot of land to another company, Commercial Development Corporation. They liked it because it had a 34-foot deep channel, 700 feet of long pier, and now it looks to be a future staging ground for the offshore wind industry, where these turbines are now up to 14 megawatts. One sweep of those blades will power an average US home for a day, one rotation. That's the kind of change we're seeing. $570 million over 5 years, boom, imploded. Why is this happening? Because of the 3Ds that Ross talked about. Will it slow down? No. Next slide, please. One of the reasons it won't slow down, yesterday I was on this call with data center operators, energy buyers and data center operators from around the planet. And I blame them for the challenges they're facing. One of them is simple. It is that at the end of the day, the entire grid is made of machines. And they produce, they transmit, and they consume electricity, whether it's your light bulb or your generator, your PV plant, whatever, your battery, whatever it is. That's all technology. And this machine you're looking at here in front of you in this slide is a series of Cray computers yoked together that does 30 quadrillion calculations per second. Her name is Corey. She's named after Gertie Corey, the first American scientist to win a Nobel Prize, female scientist. And what this machine does, besides modeling the Big Bang, is it helps people find better molecules. So you want a glass for a solar panel that's so smooth, no particulates can settle on it, no more soot, no more dust. You want a glass so smooth at that nano level, or you want the leading edge of a wind blade that flies through space at the tip at 250 miles an hour and after a few years is pitted after moving through rain, dust, insects. You want a battery that can give you twice the lifetime of battery today at twice the density. That's all material science. So researchers go and ask Corey to reach into the periodic table for about 2 weeks at a time and assemble all the elements and then come back with molecules, compounds that have never existed before in the history of the planet. Then robots get to work synthesizing those. Robots do it, which is critical because they record failures, not just successes, which means now we can use machine learning to look at that exhaust trail of data coming out of those robots and find and make better stuff faster. So if you think you're looking at a pace of change today, it's just going to get more exciting and interesting tomorrow, whether it's hydrogen batteries, solar, wind, etc. And so what we see, next slide please, is for solar, for example, you have solar panels getting 0.5% more efficient every single year because of half-cut cells, bifaciality, a whole host of different technologies, larger wafers, better inverters, the whole deal. So that over the course of 10 years, the levelized cost of energy pumped out by solar panels has now fallen by almost 90%. That's the kind of change we're seeing across the entire industry. And it's not just the technology, it's also the efficiency of the manufacturing process, the ruthless efficiency of driving out all of the inefficiencies in supply chain to give you better, cheaper modules. Next slide, please. Same thing with wind. This is the Wind Technology Testing Center, designed in 2011, built by 2013 here in Massachusetts. This shed is 90 meters long, and it's meant to vibrate the blades 2 million times in one direction, 1 million times in another, and torque them as well to simulate 20 years of environment. Here's what they didn't foresee. This is a 90-meter shed. The blade, not the one you're looking at in this picture, but the one I went to see for my book, from GE, 107-meter Halliard blade made over in Cherbourg, France at LM Wind. They had to saw off the last 30 meters of that blade because the shed is simply not big enough. And when we get to floating offshore wind, we're not looking at 15 megawatts. We could be looking at 25 or 30 because fixed structures deal with stress. Floating structures impart that stress to the ocean. And so another technology development that's going to drive down our levelized costs of energy. Next slide, please. Batteries. Over the last 2 years, the levelized cost of storage and batteries has fallen by a full 50%, and it's not done there. Contemporary Amperex technology talks about a 1,000,000-mile battery. Jeffrey Don, Tesla's former chief battery scientist, talked about a 2,000,000-mile battery. So now we're talking 8, 10, 15,000 cycles in a battery. And a lot of the limitations that affect today's economies aren't real tomorrow. So next slide, please. What we see here, my final 2 slides, these are the adoption curves. You don't have a lot of time to absorb what's going on here, but the critical thing is back in the early 1900s, it took us a while to fully absorb and adopt new technologies, whether it was washing machines, cars, dryers, etc., the earlier telephones. Today, over to the right, you can see smartphones, tablets, social media, the adoption rate going from 0% to say 90% saturation of technology in society now takes 5 years. We all know when the next version of the iPhone comes out because it's news, and the next day, half of our kids have it, right? It's the same thing that's going on with batteries and solar panels and electric vehicles and everything else. That adoption curve now moves on to steroids. What's happened so far is that from our awareness, our ability to integrate that data, we're not good at it because we still think in a linear fashion, and we can't think that way on a go-forward basis. So last slide, please. So as folks facing these dilemmas related to carbon, it's tempting to basically say, okay, I'm going to lay all my chips down on the table, cover my thing 100%, my obligations right now. The challenge around that is the costs continue to move. And so while I'm not arguing for you to do nothing, because there are savings that obtain every single day if you make those investments now, I am arguing that you need to be aware of these trends and these cost curves and these ongoing developments in the space so that you can make the best no regrets decisions you possibly can make within the context of this panoply of ongoing change. This last slide here comes from a book by Lawrence Gonzalez called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. And it's a book about adventurers who catch themselves in bad places. Some of them live. Many of the ones who do not adapt and rebuild their mental maps, understand I'm in a new place where the old rules no longer obtain, those are the ones who die. And there's a great story in that book about a plane that exploded over the Amazon in Brazil. And 14 or so people came down alive in their chairs and landed in their seats and landed with their seatbelts on under the canopy in the jungle. And they waited for rescue. They could hear the helicopters and the planes, the search planes going overhead. They didn't have the ability to signal through the canopy. They couldn't make a fire. And ultimately, those 14 people perished of starvation. Meanwhile, a couple miles away, another plane, another chair came down out of the sky with a teenage girl in it. She was badly hurt. She was alone, and she didn't have anyone to help her. She didn't succumb to groupthink. She quickly redrew her mental map, remembering what her father told her, which is water goes downhill and eventually leads to civilization. So over the course of the next 12 days, she dragged herself with an injured ankle through the jungle, finding the stream, to the brook, to the small river, and eventually collapsed unconscious in a hunter's hut on the side of the river and was found later on that evening. And she was the only one to survive. So the point of that story is simply this. In the pace of this rapid change in which we find ourselves, solar industry, in 2009, there were 518 megawatts in this country installed. Now there's over 100,000. Similar with wind, batteries are going to go the same direction. Change is happening rapidly all around us. You need to redraw your mental maps. You need to think about how to prepare for tomorrow. You need to maintain a maximum amount of optionality in the contracts you sign, in the way you think about this thing, and understand the growing carbon dilemma we find ourselves caught in. So what I've done in the last 15 minutes is essentially laid out a whole heck of a lot of problems for you and giving you no solutions. You're welcome. On to the next speaker. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you, Peter. And I think after those remarks, we probably should add a fourth D to the three big Ds, and that fourth one is disruption, caused by the first three for sure. And before you leave, Peter, why don't you give us a shameless plug for your weekly video and your book?
Yeah, so the weekly video, because I do comb through, I don't know, 250 articles a day, I tweet them all out, the ones I find important. And then at the end of the week, I go through all my tweets and grab the ones I think matter. And then over the course of the weekend, I put together my 4 to 8 stories within 5 minutes that I think were the most critical things that move the needle the prior week, whether it's a technology development piece, some kind of a regulatory decision, some new business model emerging, whatever. And then just throw that on LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to my my channel. I have it on YouTube as well. And it's great because it occasions a lot of conversation on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And then the book is essentially about the transformation of the power grid. The grid can be really dry. So what I did was try and find stories, whether it's an offshore wind one, that was the visit to the Wind Technology Testing Center. Solar, I visited some guy when they had those preemptive outages in California, and he walked me out to the panels and drew his finger across the soot on his panel and told me what was going on there. So every chapter, batteries, wind, solar, EVs, I tell a story about one individual or a few that creates the on-ramp and hopefully opens up a window of understanding. And the book was for me 10 years ago, before I understood how all these pieces tied together. So I'm hoping to reach all the SMEs in the space, as well as students and folks who are more casually interested in what it's like being in the middle of this, the largest collective thing humanity has ever tried to accomplish, which is to decarbonize our entire societal economy. It's an enormous challenge and a fascinating thing to write about. Thanks for the opportunity to plug that, Ross. It's called The Energy Switch. It's out June 15th.
Thank you, PKD. Our next speaker is Andrew Kvaal. Andrew and I have become friends over the last year. I helped Andrew's company Ampion raise some capital for their business this last year. Andrew is the Chief Operating Officer at Ampion and joined the company in 2019 after a decade of leadership roles in educational publishing and the technology industry. I'm sure, Andrew, you'll tell us how that crossover worked. Earlier in his career, Andrew led corporate strategy consulting with the Parthenon Group across a variety of industries, including education, retail, private equity. And Ampion represents a return to Andrew's roots. The initial years of Andrew's career were spent in early stage software companies. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us.
Thank you for that, Ross, and PKD, thanks for the broad intro to the challenge that we face. I mean, I think, as you can tell from my background, I don't come from the energy world, but I was attracted to the scale of the challenge that PKD laid out. I think, this is the defining issue of the rest of our lives in all likelihood. And when I encountered Ampion, which was at the time very much an early stage startup with some interesting ideas about how to contribute to these problems, it was irresistible for me. What I'm going to talk about is community solar. It's probably on the polar opposite side of the scale from what Peter was talking about, in that it's sort of a relatively narrow in the scheme of things solution that some might consider as they think about decarbonizing. And it's a emerging market that's really taking root and is accelerating quite quickly, particularly in the Northeast. So the basis of my comments are going to be primer into what the market is and essentially what's going on there and how you might think about it. So we've found that an awful lot of folks are only distantly familiar with community solar as a concept. And basically the way that I like to describe it is as a farm share concept. So it's about a solar credit, a monetary credit that is applied to a utility bill. It's generated by solar farms. They're typically 2 to 5 megawatts in scale, so sub-utility scale. They're connected to the grid. And then, obviously they're producing credits that show up for the subscribers. Here in the Northeast, you see them all over the place, particularly along highways, and so oftentimes as I'm explaining it to folks, it immediately clicks in that they've seen them physically and can understand basically what we're talking about. Of course, they're enabled by state legislation. So states like Massachusetts, New York, Maine is extraordinarily hot right now, create incentive structures through their renewable programs that encourage the development of these solar farms and create kind of the monetization programs that allow developers to both invest and then monetize them. So that's the nature of the model. Next slide, please. We're seeing like unbelievable growth in this market. It's been Even in the about 2 years that I've been tracking it, it's in a totally different place than it was since I've started. So the way I like to tell the story is 4 or 5 years ago, there were a handful of programs. They were early days. They were relatively small pilots. They had sort of rough edges all over the place in terms of the way in which they were constructed and the nature in which they were operated. That's really changing. And today there are programs in 20 states plus DC. There's over 2.5 gigawatts already interconnected. We see growth of the market accelerating to be more than 15 gigawatts over the next 5 years. So from where we're seated, certainly that's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And that's all before we factor in the Biden clean energy plans, which mention community solar specifically, but don't provide any guidance on exactly how that may play out. Yeah, just one more point on that from the last slide is like the way that we talk about it and think about it is that distributed solar and community solar is one of a whole bunch of different levers necessary for the decarbonization effort. So certainly, those impressive offshore wind turbines are going to be huge contributors, and utility scale solar is part of the solution. But as we're talking to folks, like there just isn't enough physical spots out there to put all of the generation necessary to meet these aggressive and necessary targets. And so looking for smaller areas where smaller sub-utility scale installations can be built, and then connecting them via a program that actually makes economic sense, is an important part of the overall plan to decarbonize. On the right side of this slide is a chart that I grabbed from a McKinsey study. It's an interesting study that looks at how New York State specifically is going to play out over the next 20 years plus. And it shows you, of course, that distributed solar and the community orientation is going to be a modest but discernible element of the total. It's a fascinating study, by the way. I'd be happy to share it with you, and it gives a real blueprint for how this may play out, over the next couple of decades. Next, please. So, the question is why does this exist? And, what is the point of having community solar as a product model, among the options that exist? And, looking at that from the point of view of various stakeholders, certainly for policymakers, where all this begins, it's allowing development in areas that are otherwise inaccessible. So personally, I live just outside Boston, and if you look at Northeast Massachusetts, very, very difficult to get new solar installations built. Land costs, of course, are just prohibitively expensive. And then, there's a bunch of other related benefits of just, distributed generation that probably folks in this call know well, around grid resiliency and avoided costs. And then finally, and an important one that often comes up is the desire to create mechanisms for social justice related to energy. And so community solar is oftentimes oriented towards populations of disadvantaged populations that are disproportionately affected by brown power and lack the economic ability to make personal decisions that affect that. So it's a very strong theme in many of the policy debates that govern the emergence of this class. On the developer side of the equation, there's incredible interest in community solar, and this interest has emerged and really strengthened over the couple of years that I've been working in the sector. If you wound the clock back 3 or 4 or 5 years, what you would have seen was predominantly opportunists participating in the market from this side. So brand new regulatory programs and incentives, people taking advantage of it that typically were more or less in the right place at the right time and had the wherewithal to understand how to participate. Typically, they looked like smaller, developers and investors in the space. What we've seen, over the last couple of years, and candidly, like this is accelerating very, very quickly, is the interest in extremely large, energy production companies. And so what's happening is sort of professional investors in generation, whether they own and operate the assets themselves or they are financial investors in the space, are coming and building out fairly large and scaled portfolios of assets, typically in, hundreds of megawatts at a time that are spread across multiple markets simultaneously. And they're looking to build out, like really meaningful businesses. The reasons why they like it are probably pretty straightforward to understand. I mean, the first obvious reason is the incentive structures are pretty nice. They can essentially approximate retail rates for the power that they're producing. So just the core economics of running the sites are attractive. Another reason that we oftentimes hear that it's attractive relates to this concept of replaceability. Because it's a subscriber-based product, that allows flexibility for the off-takers and for the contracts that govern those off-takers. There is not the concept of lock-in that exists when you have a physical development for an individual client. So that radically changes the risk profile of that project finance asset. You can sort of swap it out whenever you need to, and allows for much greater flexibility when thinking about that cash flow over time. On the consumer side, there is a wide range of consumers that take advantage of community solar. One end of the spectrum is certainly residential, which would appeal perhaps to folks on this call on a personal level, and you can sign up as a subscriber for yourself. Under those circumstances, the appeal is a couple of things. It's a modest amount of savings, typically 10% off of the credits that you receive. But equally important is the ability to participate in sort of green energy personally, which for the vast majority of Americans is actually not available. So the number of folks that are able to actually put panels on their roofs, for instance, and directly participate is pretty limited, maybe a quarter of the total population, and that's limited by where you live geographically, whether you rent or own your house, and of course your economic means. For corporate buyers, typically, the attraction is financial first and foremost. Like I said, the credits are typically priced at a 10% discount. And so it is an immediate and guaranteed hedge on electricity pricing. You get credits and they're always going to be discounted by 10%. And so that's an attractive economic proposition for many of the corporate off-takers that we contract with. And it's also a fairly easy and visible way to support the green economy. So for instance, we work with a number of higher ed institutions, and their constituencies are extraordinarily sensitive to both direct and indirect means of improving the sort of green profile of the institution. This is something that is incredibly visible and tangible for those folks. The one thing it is not, and I think it's relevant for this group in particular, is it's not RECs. So the RECs typically don't pass along. And the way that we manage that with our corporate off-takers is using the savings to purchase RECs, if that's the outcome that's necessary for the ESG program or what have you. All right, next slide, please. So, a short plug on what Ampion does and how we sort of sit in the middle of this industry. A way to think about this is upstream, you have owner-operators of community solar farms, and they're responsible for siting and construction and the ongoing physical operation of the site. We're responsible for everything else. And so that means finding and contracting subscribers, which can be a fairly arduous and difficult activity. The type of subscriber necessary is oftentimes dictated by the nature of the state program. the credit requirements of the owner-operator, and various considerations like that. So it's a little bit of a Tetris game to find an appropriate off-taker and get them signed up. We then do what we call revenue management, so the ongoing financial management of the site. So subscribers get credits, credits need to be paid for, we do billing and payment and that reconciliation. And through that, we provide a lifetime system of record. So obviously there's a tremendous amount of transactional information regarding the financial performance of these assets, understanding how those assets perform, understanding how various types of subscribers perform against those assets, and enabling a variety of constituents, whether it's the owner, the regulator, the utility, or the financier, to get the information that they need in order to be comfortable or meet their requirements is a big part of what we do. Next slide, please. The growth of this market, while off of kind of a nascent and early base, is extremely strong, as I said, and we see it accelerating. There are a handful of issues that impede our progress, and I thought I would just mention a couple of them, and maybe this will spur a discussion later on today. The first is the nature of the ITC and tax equity. Because it requires ownership in the sites, it creates a real bottleneck on the financing of sites. There's a limited number of equity partners that are willing to take on those sorts of positions. They're typically arm's length from the day-to-day operations of the sector specifically, and oftentimes they have incredibly onerous expectations in terms of the credit profile of off-takers born of their experience with PPAs and older models where the risk profiles are candidly just a little bit different. So that's a major inhibitor for us right now in the market. A second is every single state is figuring this out in real time, or nearly all of them. And all of these state programs, while they're coalescing around many common themes, they often like to introduce their own variations on a theme. And so we find that unique state rules that are complicated, that sometimes limit participation, that require bespoke workflows and technology integrations, slow down the adoption, both on the investment side and then certainly how we as Ampion can sit in the middle and service it. And then finally, as you might well imagine, it's an industry that's fueled by the data, and the ability to access the data that's necessary on the timing that's necessary in order to deliver the right sort of subscriber experience can be extraordinarily difficult. Oftentimes we run into hurdles that are created by, antiquated utility systems, probably slower to adoption utility mentalities. And so fighting through data to enable that customer experience is something that we work on every single day. So that's the end of my slides. I'd sum it up by saying we're like one of those fast growing, frenetic, opportunity areas in this constantly changing energy world, and offer a, unique and pretty exciting alternative for folks that are looking to both reduce their energy costs and find ways to support green energy along the way. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Andrew. Fascinating. This reminds me a lot of the early days of the deregulation of the retail electricity markets. I know your founder has got a lot of experience with that as well. And we were fighting through in each state having, and each utility having a different set of business rules of how you actually even switch a customer. And actually, several of us went and founded an organization called the Coalition for Uniform Business Rules, which with a model set of business rules for how states ought to unbundle retail. So thank you for that. We'll have some questions for you later. Next two speakers hail from Houston, Texas. I know them both quite well. Eric Elam is the CEO of RPD Energy and has managed various retail and wholesale energy business over the last 20 years. Proven track record across sales, operations, structuring, and M&A. Throughout his career, Eric has gravitated towards early stage and turnaround businesses, and particular expertise in helping customers identify innovative solutions to meet their energy-related objectives. I can attest that Eric is a real pioneer in this space. So welcome, Eric. Tell us about RPD Energy.
Well, thank you, Ross. It's been an interesting session so far, going from PKD's energy and macro view to getting the opportunity to learn a little bit more about the community solar space from somebody who sits in the middle of it. And I think what I'm going to try and do with these comments is get a little bit more on the demand side of the equation, look at it from the end user's perspective, and say, accelerated pace, technology change, lots of risk. I'm not an energy professional. I build widgets or whatever I do. How do I sort all this stuff out? And so hopefully my remarks and comments and a little description about how we view the world and we view this particular market space may be helpful in getting people there. So let me start with just a little bit of background on RPD Energy. If you want to go to the next slide, Ross. PKD likes stories, and this is a pretty good story. There's a gentleman by the name of Greg Staple. Greg was the chairman of the American Clean Skies Foundation, which was a nonprofit lobbying group in DC that focused on sustainability related issues and policy making within the federal government infrastructure. And Greg was a lawyer and well known in the sustainability community, and decided about 6 years ago that he really wanted to find a way to make an impact in the market by doing something commercial beyond just policy. And so he came up with the concept for what he called Renewable Power Direct, and has since morphed into what we now call RPD Energy. And the idea was to make renewable energy affordable, simple, and impactful for people to be able to access and buy it. So the novelty of the concept was, instead of looking at an infrastructure down approach to how do we push renewable energy out, it was more of a pull side from the end user, saying, how is the market going to evolve to get me what I need? And RPD Energy was formed to create commercial transactions that make it as easy for corporate buyers to access renewable power as the way that they access brown power in their traditional buying processes. So to do all of that, we figured that the best way was to create a team of experienced people who understood wholesale trading, retail marketing, retail energy, and the tools that make all that work for brown power, and find unique ways to apply those to renewable assets and create products, solutions, and structures that made sense for end users to buy in this otherwise rather chaotic transitioning world. So to that extent, RPD Energy has spent a lot of time over the last several years in educating the market about alternatives. And we're going to talk about some of that today as it relates to some of the macro level concepts that were articulated earlier by PKD. So in that time, we have developed strong transactional relationships. We've done a number of transactions. We have a number of clients that range in type, from companies like Intuit, the software manufacturer of TurboTax and Mint Software and some of those things, to healthcare companies like McKesson, US Oncology, data center and data companies like Iron Mountain, et cetera. So our approach has been customer first. Figure out what it is that the customer really wants and needs to be able to meet their objectives, and under what time frame and under what kind of risk management scenario, and then use market tools to go make that happen for them, to give them impactful access to local, physical, renewable energy, not just brown plus recs. So as we think about, go ahead to the next slide, as we think about the landscape of options available to corporate buyers in the renewable energy area, the one thing that keeps popping out in the press is PPAs and VPPAs. It's a fantastic thing when Amazon or Microsoft or Google is able to stand behind a long-term PPA and go build a new wind farm. That's a wonderful thing. However, it's not necessarily a thing that's a good fit for the vast majority of corporate buyers who don't have the capability, the resources, the asset base to become the financial off-taker, take on the 12 to 15 year term associated complexity and the forward market risk associated with PPA and VPPA structures that were originally built for utilities. But we hear a lot about PPAs. We hear about how successful they've been in driving the market, but let's really look at the numbers. So this chart is one that most of us in the space are pretty familiar with. It was started by BRC, a subsidiary of RMI. It's now been taken over by REBA. But it shows the growth of PPAs and VPPAs year over year. And I apologize, I only had access to 2020 data through the end of Q3. But we can see that even in its most significant year to date in 2019, the aggregation of all of these PPAs are barely a drop in the bucket against what voluntary competitive electricity purchases actually are. So what does that really tell us about this roadmap? Does it mean we all have to force fit ourselves into a model that requires building a wind farm and being a PPA or a VPPA off-taker? Or does it tell us that maybe we're never going to get there by trying to push things into the market that don't fit exactly right? Rather, maybe what we need to do is think about how we flip the equation and say, what do end users want and need in this chaotic environment of accelerated change, and figure out how to meet those needs where they sit today. So if you want to go to the next slide. So across the spectrum of options available to corporate buyers, if you think of PPAs and VPPAs on one end of the spectrum, and you think about Brown plus RECs, kind of a traditional solution on the other end of the spectrum, there really wasn't a whole lot in between, unless you could work with a solar developer to do an on-site solar project or rooftop if your building happened to be situated in a certain way or in a certain place, and you could look at some kind of, on-site options like we all used to do with cogeneration. But there wasn't a whole lot in between. There wasn't anybody who was saying, how do I make renewable power as easy to buy as brown power? So we focus at RPD Energy on trying to fill that vacuum in the middle of that spectrum by focusing on product solutions that you buy like you do brown power. So typically 2 to 5 year kind of terms. We can go a little shorter, you go a little longer, just like a retail energy, any other standard retail energy contract. We want to make them right sized. You don't have to be the off taker for 100 megawatts of wind when you have 5 megawatts of load in Illinois that you're trying to address. So one of the parameters was, how do we make it right sized for people to meet their needs where they sit? And then we want to make it impactful, right? The problem with RECs is you don't really know what you're getting when you buy a REC. They're valid for up to 3 vintage years. I could have this month, my coverage from RECs could be 2018 vintage RECs from West Texas, and next month it might be 2019 vintage RECs from somewhere in Illinois. There's no connection to the impact that you're making through your green energy spend as a part of your overall utility budget. And in fact, when you buy RECs only, literally less than 2% of your utility spend is actually going to support something green, and you can't even really tell what it is that you're supporting. So we had to find a way to make it impactful. And obviously, affordability is always a concern in the corporate world. We have to find a way to do all this in a manner that's competitive with the options that they have for brown power. So at the end of the day, what RPD Energy has been trying to promote in the marketplace amongst a variety of transaction counterparties is to deliver the benefits of a PPA, but without the internal challenges and complexity associated with getting one done within your organization, and without taking on the long-term commitment and risk. Next slide, Ross. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because from the buyer's standpoint, it's pretty simple. You're contracting through a series of parties that starts with your retail energy provider, You can use the same one that you do today for brown power, or you can bring on another retail energy provider, but they are going to take and receive supply from a physical renewable asset that's scheduled into the grid, comes associated with the concurrent RECs that make it green, and they're going to deliver it to you in the same way and on the same paper that you would buy brown power from them under a retail energy contract in a competitive market. What you get out of it is you know exactly where your green energy is sourced, you know exactly why it's green and what makes it green, and you know exactly the impact that you're making on the local community and on that particular component of the renewable energy sector. How we make it happen is a little different story. It's a little more complicated. This is where the folks who understand market tools and how to apply them come in. What RPD does is we make the wholesale transaction look like a standard wholesale transaction for the renewable generator. We make the retail product look like a standard retail product for the retail energy supplier and for the customer. We take on the internal pieces that make all of that possible to deliver something at the end of the day is simple, affordable, and impactful. Go ahead, Ross. So all of that sounds interesting. And as I said, what we're trying to do is create options that sit in the middle ground that retain flexibility, retain optionality for you, and address the current conflicting needs that you see by all the change around you. But somebody is inevitably going to step up and say, well, what about additionality? If I'm not doing a PPA, if I'm not building my own wind farm, how am I really contributing anything? Well, I know that we had somebody from the Green Power Partnership on earlier in one of the previous panels. And so I thought it was apropos to pull something from the US EPA from a white paper that they did that kind of talks about additionality. And what they say is essentially consistent with what I've been saying throughout this little discussion, which is, you know, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Walmart, build your own wind farm, great thing, good thing to do. It's not the only thing to do. In fact, smaller purchases that drive demand also make a significant impact and are necessary for us to ultimately transition the overall infrastructure of the electric grid to a heavier reliance on renewable energy. So when I think about additionality, and we served as a founding member of BRC and have been on the advisory board for years, and I have these long philosophical debates with others in the sector about what additionality really means. And to us, it's very simple. And I draw the analogy of an organic tomato. If I want to support organic farming, I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to go to my organic vegetable aisle and I'm going to pick up an organic tomato and I'm going to look at it, and I'm not looking for a sticker that says this organic farmer just started farming a week ago. I really don't care when they started farming. I know that if I buy an organic tomato, intuitively I understand that I'm driving demand. And the more of me that buys more tomatoes drives more demand for organic farming, which in turn is going to drive more supply of organic agriculture. We don't think energy should look any different. Jules from REI put out a white paper a couple of days ago talking about the topic of how things are going to change under a Biden administration. And he pointed to the examples of centralized government-led programs and the importance of building out infrastructure in the US and the US economy. And he pointed to the development of the highway system, the development of the internet, et cetera. Well, my little organic farming analogy fits there too. We didn't get to the internet without people wanting to have access to it. We're not going to get to a full transformation of the grid if we don't have people having the ability to easily and affordably access renewable power. So our view of additionality is that if we can drive demand by making it easy, then we're going to make an impact that's similar to the impact that's being made by, hey kids, let's go build a wind farm. Ross, last slide. So what does all this mean about corporate renewable models for renewable energy? It means several things. Number one, driving demand is the fastest way to achieve transformation. It's what's going to happen. We can't push it into the marketplace. The marketplace has to pull it and demand it and let the market be responsive. The best way to do that is to make it easy, affordable, and impactful to access physical renewable power. We understand that you don't have to force fit your company into a model that doesn't work for you. We understand from PKD's comments about how fast the landscape is changing. I often ask corporate buyers today, who are confused by all of that, and say, why on earth would we lock ourselves into today's model when no one can tell us what options we're going to have 4 or 5 years from now? Why would I do 15 years under today's solution when 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, I'm going to have a totally different view of what my flexibility and what my competitive status is going to be relative to renewable power and meeting my sustainability objectives. The last couple thoughts are, again, I think as PKD said, as you heard earlier, the time to do something is now, right? The bandwagon is rolling, the momentum's achieved. People have spent the last few years looking at options. How do I get involved today to be responsive to the pressures that I feel from my activist investors, from ESG influences in the capital community, to address the exposure that I have to presenting a sustainable investment opportunity as a business? Well, I need to prove that I can do something now, but I don't have to do something now that doesn't work for me. There are alternatives. So that's really the bottom line, is seek out those alternatives that meet your needs where you sit today, and expect the market participants to be creative enough to develop, fulfill, and deliver a solution that's actually made for you and not made for you to have to fit into. That's all I got for now.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we'll have questions for you coming forward. So our last speaker is a friend of mine, and whom I want to personally thank. We had an unexpected cancellation of a speaker yesterday, and I gave John a call and asked him for a favor to step in. This happens to be sort of in his wheelhouse as well. John has been a career entrepreneur since high school. I think he started his first business, which was a roofing business in high school. It became a multi-million-dollar business. And I was fascinated, John, to learn that you served as the president of the Resource Alliance Group, which basically was a not-for-profit helping displaced energy executives launching their own business ventures. I would guess that the Resource Alliance Group probably has maybe some clients from Keystone Pipeline as of today, prospective clients anyway. John is a founder of Acclaim Energy, from the early stage development to the creation of its strategic energy management value proposition. Today, Acclaim serves as the energy advisor for C&I customers, multinationals, hospitals, cities, universities, government entities across the United States and Mexico. I just learned about Mexico recently. And they have a 97+% customer retention rate. So please welcome John Elder. Thanks.
Ross, thank you very much. And quite frankly, to come behind Eric, Andrew, and PKD, this is a big day. And as I was listening to everyone's comments, is that it was very interesting for me, because Acclaim sits on sort of another perspective on this whole renewable and sustainability conversation, in that Acclaim works strictly for customers, okay, the very largest of them, to make sure that they're making the very best business decisions that they can around this whole conversation of energy, which has gotten incredibly complex. And for me, it's been really, really gratifying to watch kind of the energy conversation go from the boiler room now up to the boardroom, okay? Because that's really what's happened is that it's gone from kind of an afterthought, okay? And today it's a senior executive focus because of a lot of the things that everyone's been talking about. Okay. And so what I'm going to do today is give you I'm going to give you an actual case study of a journey that we took with a very large customer that wanted to pursue the renewable 100% goal that everybody is talking about and how it really rolled out. Okay. And the one theme that I want you all to think through is that, and PKD hit it pretty dadgum well, is that transformation is the key to what's going on in this world. Okay, there is no guarantees on anything in terms of what the world's going to look like in much shorter order than people think. So that drove our business decision 18 years ago that we figured that the customer is the only thing that's guaranteed to survive. So that's the guy that we're going to help. Everything else is a variable, because I would say that's what we've actually found in the marketplace today. Okay, so let me give you the kind of and my goal is to create a little bit of creativity here with regards to the conversation, in that and hopefully it creates some thinking. But we had shortly ago a request from one of our larger clients and one of the largest clients in Texas that to evaluate whether or not that they should pursue a 100% renewable strategy, and if they should take advantage of an offer that had been presented to them that looked fantastic. Okay, so this was a big conversation at the regent level, and you had enthusiasm for pursuing this so long as it made good sense. Okay, so Ross, you want to switch the next slide? Okay, is that we'll go ahead and go to the next. I apologize, I'm jumping forward on you a little bit. One more, or Daniel, if you can just go ahead and switch. Okay, so what's happened is that the system was approached, okay, with an option, and the story on it from the option went, hey, look at the prices of renewable generation and how far that they've come down, and now they are competitive with your traditional purchasing methodology, and we will be able to have a whole different story with regards to all of our stakeholders. Okay, and none of what was presented to them in terms of this was actually wrong, okay, but maybe it just didn't tell the whole story to a customer that wanted to pursue this type of thing, but also needed to make very good business decisions. Because what you have is that, and what we found, which is kind of what some of the other presenters have indicated, is that unless you're a Google, a Facebook, a large Fortune 100, that this is about brand creation. This is about their stock valuation because of what they stand for in their markets. Where price and risk really doesn't matter. Is that this becomes a financially critical decision that's got to make business sense for the end use customer. Okay, and our view on it before we get into this is that ultimately the market will prevail. Okay, meaning that you've got to drive to this. You've got lots of money going toward this, and a lot of the things that I'm going to tell you that we found on it will ultimately get solved because it's going to ultimately make good business sense. But until it gets there, there are questions that we want people to ask and to think through. Okay, so next slide. Okay, all righty. Is that the opportunity was presented to the client. The opportunity stated, hey, look, these are going to be the prices and the value that we're going to be looking to secure for you. And this is going to be a 15 or 20-year option, okay, for you to have these kind of benefits, all right? Now, what happens, though, is that when you start looking at delivered energy, okay, from the customer's perspective, the mechanics of just the electrons is one piece of the puzzle, what you're paying for that. But when you start analyzing what is the actual budget impact, basically what does this cost to you in total by the time that you finish writing all your checks is really what makes a difference, okay? And in the business, we call it embedded risks. I mean, there's some different descriptions of it, but the bottom line is it's the additive costs that may or may not be in your energy cost that you will end up paying. Okay, so in this case, I'm just going to hit a couple of the top ones. Okay, is that we found out that what's really going on, which is a problem that that some of the other folks had mentioned, is that the underlying driver is that to be able to get a plant financed is that you've got to have long-term cash flows that a financier is going to look to pay their to cover their cost, cover their payments. All right, is that when you don't have a bunch of Googles out there, you got to figure another way to do it. So what this program was about identifying Class A credits, basically very good credits to be on the PPAs here to help them get the thing developed. So what you're really doing is, if you walk into some of these early stage things, the way that they're structured today, is you're basically letting them use your credit to be able to develop the project. And that's what was happening here, which by itself is not a bad thing, but awareness is a key. All right. The things that were really more challenging on it is that some of the things that were in the structure of this contract, which all the risks were being borne by the end use customer. Okay. In terms of if you have issues where there's a difference in where this generation is versus where your consuming is that we have basis risks. Okay. Which sometimes can be very benign and not make any difference. Other times they could break your budget. Okay. So what was happening was that the way that the construct of the PPA was set up was that the customer, unbeknownst to them, was going to wear risks they didn't even understand. Okay. So there were other examples of what we call embedded risks in the contract that really don't bear discussion at this point. But the bottom line is that what they were presented versus what kind of predictability that they could have over a 15 to 20 year period said, we need to think about this because it makes a difference. We've got to make, this is coming from the customer's perspective, we need to make financially responsible decisions. We do have a renewable and a social dimension to all of our thinking, but it's got to make sense. And this is what we're finding in everything below the Fortune 100, where they want to do this, much to what the everybody else has indicated. They have a desire and they have a push to be able to do it, but the market has to provide products and a methodology that they can comfortably do these things and make sure that it makes business sense for them. Okay, so our some of the products that you've heard about have kind of bridged that gap. We've got some issues around 1 to 5 year contracts that actually can happen, but there's no way right now for suppliers to properly hedge very long-term types of situations within the renewable structure. Okay, so there's lots more details into the weeds, but the bottom line is that where we ended up with these people, okay, was, look, this is great, and now y'all have a deeper understanding of what this meant. Okay, but what ended up happening is that they had a framework to understand what's going to make sense for them and when. Okay, so that they're in a position that as the marketplace evolves and as technology changes, is that when it hits the situation where it's right for them, is that we will do something for them for a long period. And the key to that is that they ended up with a plan, okay, a strategic plan, which I think, I don't remember if that was who mentioned that, but you're going to have a plan around sustainability that matches your company's risk profile that needs to guide this decision. Because if you're just reacting and you're waiting until the last minute to do things, or you feel compelled to do something, is that it's a recipe in a transforming market for getting into something you wish you never heard of. Okay, then that's been our experience. Now, the regulations are going to change dramatically. Technology is changing dramatically, and the world that we're all looking at will look very much different in a very short period of time based on everything that we're seeing. Okay, so next slide on it is that this whole ESG concept, which is what's driving, kind of the acronym that they've kind of created around this concept. Okay, it's real, guys. We do business on the worldwide stage. and it is real across the board, and it's real into very, very small companies because of the social awareness of the need to pursue these things. And so it's a part of it's going to be a part of everything that that you're going to hear going forward. And it's just beginning. It's in the first stages of big money focusing on it. Okay, really big money focusing on it. Companies willing to invest in the additional technologies to make these things that were theoretical actually happen. Okay, all the papers that we've all been reading for many years to most people is brand new stuff. And a lot of it is not really out there in the marketplace being used and being deployed at the level that you would think it is from a customer standpoint. So I would say is buckle up. It's a very real conversation. It is happening, and we're looking forward to this thing evolving and being able to know that we never put any long bets on anything, because it's just that uncertain as to what the world's going to look like here in short order. And Ross, that's all I have.
Thank you, John. That was very enlightening, so to speak. The chat line is open if you have questions for our panel. I see we've got a couple here that we'll get to in a minute. You know, John, you know, and listening to you, when in your opening remarks regarding the one thing that remains constant is the customer. I had a client in Houston by the name of the distribution utility there in Houston, that when you guys went through deregulation and they had to get out of the retail electricity business, they thought they were out of the customer business. And it took them like a few years to figure out, wait a minute, you know, we're the only thing that doesn't change with the customer. We're the distribution utility. Everything else changes. You know, we are definitely in the customer business, and we need to help protect those customers. And I certainly appreciate that. And in listening to you, you know, my wife is a real estate agent, and it almost sounds to me like what you're promoting for commercial industrial customers, particularly in deregulated retail markets, is hiring someone like Acclaim that basically is going to act on their behalf as a fiduciary to make sure that they understand the risks they're going to be encountering and how to manage them and how to deal with the various offers that are out there. Is that really what you're talking about? Is kind of an agency relationship?
And Ross, thanks for the subtle plug, okay, with regards to it. But in all seriousness, what's happened to this whole energy conversation, and if you put up the last slide that we had, which was just about us, okay, is that it's gotten incredibly complex, okay, is that and it's all interrelated. So we're having a conversation today about renewables, okay? Well, that plays into resiliency, that plays into reliability. It plays into how it is that you're, from a regulatory standpoint, handling different things. It is a puzzle that's all integrated, and it's gotten incredibly complex. Now, the irony behind that, though, is that there's also huge value in the energy budget, meaning that if you've got an understanding of the interrelationships on all the moving parts, there's a huge opportunity to reduce costs, okay? Speaking in terms of you have tools that have been developed now that, and we're doing a lot of this type of work, that actually optimizes and does things at a meter level to capture what the government estimates being 30% waste. I'm going to tell you, we capture 20% of it just blind, okay? So what I would tell you is that it's a situation where I think about 80% of the big companies in the United States use some sort of consulting just on the procurement side. But what's going to happen is that as the conversation gets more and more complex, it's going to be critical, but it also is going to be, it's the highest impact that a company can do on their EBITDA by minimizing their energy budget, because everything in it goes straight down. So I would, yes, tell you that the more complex this conversation gets, which everybody can see that that's what's happening, the more critical it's going to be to get a holistic guidance to make sure that you're making the right decisions, because they're some of the biggest decisions to impact your company.
Okay, thank you, John. I want to go back to PKD, and I know PKD, you have been studying a bit about FERC Order 2222 And I'd be interested in your thoughts on what's that FERC Order 2222's impact on the growth of renewables and particularly distributed renewables in the U.S. And how long is it going to take for that to happen? I remember back when FERC Order 719 came out. It took the ISOs about 3 years to figure out what are the business rules associated with getting demand response into wholesale markets. Are we going to be faced another 3 to 5 years of fiddling around with business rules to be able to get this to work?
Yeah, it's going to take a little while. I mean, the theoretical potential, Neil Chatterjee, former chairman Neil Chatterjee, when he was talking about 2222, he cited 2 studies with somewhere between 80 and 367 gigawatts of potential DER, capacity. Now, the interesting thing about renewables is you kind of have this dance where you can integrate X amount of renewables into the grid, at which point, because of its intermittency, easy for me to say, you start to create instability. That requires the bringing in of resources such as 4 hours of batteries, right? So you're seeing more and more developers like NextEra, whom you mentioned before, marrying 4 hours of batteries with especially with their solar projects. In fact, NextEra indicated this year they're going to install enough batteries that the entire state of Rhode Island, they would be able to power for 4 hours. That's just one company. So batteries are a piece of the equation, but I was talking with one of the largest solar developers, again, for the book last year. And I said, so are you going to add batteries to what you're doing? He goes, nope, because we think that distributed energy resources, like what's happening with 2222, any volatility created in the market by renewables, there will be responsive assets aggregated on the customer side of the meter, which will respond to those volatilities in the market by virtue of their inherent and natural elasticities, responsiveness to price. Now, the challenge is, if you've got a system right now where you have an ISO that's asking for a water heater not to consume power, that's one thing because it's bidirectional and it's simply not doing something. But more and more, as we see batteries going in behind the meter, companies like Sunrun and others are indicating a 60% attach rate. That is 60% of new sales of solar in California have batteries attached, right? STEM, same sorts of thing. Generac, the backup generator companies, now getting into solar and storage. So is the inverter company, I'm not SolarEdge, the other one. I'll think of it in a minute. At any rate, the challenge is ISO calls for what, say 50 megawatts, and it's in some pockets. Does the distribution company have any idea that's coming? No. And so now you have this bidirectional flow of power almost instantaneously moving the opposite way across the lines and systems that were not designed for that. And so we're going to have to create situational awareness. Probably the micro phaser, the PMUs, the phasor measurement units that are used in the grid right now at the highest level in the synchrophasers, the 4,500 of them across the bulk power grid, probably going to need something like that and a new architecture that will allow for the unleashing of the potential tens, hundreds, potentially multiple hundreds of gigawatts of responsive assets. Right now, they couldn't even get onto the road and drive because the highway is not set up for them to do it in large scale. It just, that architecture is not there. The players aren't there. Right now, it's all point to points. And unless we start to create new enabling technologies and models around that interaction, we will not be able to fully realize the potential that those DERs can offer to the grid. So that was a long answer to a short question.
Thank you, PKD. Andrew, this question is for you. It's actually, I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have come up. First of all, the easy one. The question is, what states do you see as being the best states for community solar developers over the next several years? And then, who are these developers anyway? Are these, is it Wall Street? Are these utilities? Are they third parties? And then the third part of that question is, there's something unique about community solar in that, as I understand it, you don't need transmission to deliver it. You're actually connected on the distribution system. Is that right?
That's right. Yep. All right. So I'll start with states. I mean, it is a state-by-state game, and it's also an evolutionary game within every state. So a state will start typically with a pilot program and run that for a year or two, and then our experience has been that they then double down and they add significantly to the capacity in those programs. What we're seeing is certainly like the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic are areas where there's just a crazy amount of activity. And, partly that's probably because that's where we are. And so it's closest to what we see. In the moment, Maine is incredibly hot. You wouldn't necessarily expect that. Small state, tons and tons of activity. New York has, as you probably well know, very aggressive goals and, just a massive amount of development going on. Massachusetts has always been good. They're a little further along in their incentive program, which makes it less lucrative. We hear a ton about places like New Jersey, who's into now their second tranche. Pennsylvania's getting a ton of interest. Maryland's getting a ton of interest, and Virginia. So those are the states that we talk about most kind of internally in our organization. And again, I think that reflects our geography a bit. Every once in a while, we'll hear something about California, which has a program, but hasn't been that successful in recent years because of the way that it's structured. So there are whispers that might open up, and of course that would be phenomenal as well. So you asked, like, who are the folks that are investing in building out capacity, and they do come in a variety of flavors. So there are utility affiliates, like Con Ed Solutions, for instance, has a nice portfolio. There are like NextEra, come up on this call a couple of times, like they're pretty active. There are places like energy generation companies like Ameresco are in the game. There are large private equities like investors that do quite a bit. Generate Capital comes to mind. So you get a mix across the board. All of those, I would say, fit in this category of professional investor looking to build, a scaled portfolio. And then beneath that, you have like a fairly large number of smaller developers who are, opportunistically developing sites with an eye towards ultimately flipping them to an aggregator one way or another. So that's the landscape.
Okay, one follow-up question on that. I get it that why this model is attractive to the developer, because if I understand this right, you're basically taking an asset that would normally be sold into the wholesale market or maybe on a PPA to the utility, and you're literally turning it into a retail product, so that the margin I'm guessing is 20, 30, 40% higher than they would have gotten before. That seems fascinating. Why can't you do this with any kind of distributed resource? Why can't you do this with fuel cells? Why can't you do this with?
Oh, you can. As a matter of fact, you can. And so the shorthand that we use is community solar, because predominantly that's the activity that we see. We increasingly see other sources of generation attached to these programs. So there's some community hydro going on in New York State, for instance. Down in Westchester and Manhattan, in the Con Ed world, fuel cells are much more prominent, and the nature of the incentive structure sometimes can play out a little bit differently. So this is super nuanced, but in the New York feeder stack, you don't get the value of E for fuel cells. So it's a little less lucrative to do that, but obviously it fits better down in Manhattan. And so lots of folks are headed that way.
Okay. Eric, this question for you actually, again, I'm going to do a twofer again here. One question is verbatim here. I enjoyed the presentation. Wondering, does the buyer in the model you describe lock into a price with RPD that's slightly higher than they would get through a longer term renewable generator, but competitive against wholesale price? Is it the advantage of RPD's model that is shorter in contracts? Is it just trying to follow the dollars? And the second part of the question is, in your model, where demand drives renewables? Is it we get to a place where renewables are going to be less expensive and be a bigger driver than sustainability goals, or is it a combination of the two?
Thanks, Ross. Great questions, both very different. First one's first. In a limited amount of time in a diversified audience, it's kind of hard to describe exactly what RPD does. We are not a retail provider. We don't contract with customers. We are really an enabler of these renewable solutions for generators and developers, for wholesale trading counterparties, for retail energy providers like Direct and Constellation and those folks. That, and our role is to create the solutions that they can deliver to the Iron Mountains and the Intuits and the McKesson healthcare systems that meet their sustainability objectives. But we're also not a consultant or a broker, so we don't compete with John and Acclaim. I think the way he described what they do and the role and the value that they bring to end users was very well put. You know, what we do is we want to help John find access to the best solution for his customer by putting together the right thing that meets their needs. And we'll do the heavy lifting on the wholesale side with the generator and developer, bring the retail product to whatever retail provider, you know, John and his client want to use. So you don't really contract with us. But the gist of the question, I think, was, do we lock into a slightly higher price, you know, with RPD that's offset by shorter term flexibility? The answer is that the pricing around the solutions we build is all market driven and market based. So as of now, we sit in most regions of the country in what we call a backwardated forward market, meaning that the further you go out over the next several years, you tend to see lower and lower fixed prices. So finding that sweet spot in what makes sense for you as a buyer and your budget targets, you know, is a part of the process that we can help with. But when we bring physical renewable power into a retail structure for you, it's going to be built in exactly the same way that a brown power deal would. So pricing will be market based. It'll be flexible to accommodate whatever pricing mechanism you want or are used to. So fixed price, full requirements, block and index, heat rates, all of that stuff we can do with physical renewable energy. It's just up to us to make it happen with your retailer. So hopefully that answers the first part of the question. The second part was, you know, sort of look into the crystal ball, and as we really drive demand by driving easy accessibility, you know, what happens to the supply side? I think the answer is, you know, the supply side will continue to grow through a combination of public-private partnerships, through the Biden administration pushing billions of dollars in incentives into the infrastructure development to support overall the supply side of the equation and the infrastructure side of the equation. All of those things are good for all of us to help meet rising demand. But as a way to bridge to get there, we need to continue to find ways to drive demand by making it easy for folks to get. And so I think we'll see some cyclicality over the next few years in how that works. We see it now. We work with primarily merchant capacity from existing assets. There are times where we may go through a few month cycles where supply is a little tighter than it is at other times. And we go through periods of significant liquidity where it's very easy to go find the physical generation that we want and need to create those solutions. So I think we'll see cyclicality. I think long term, the market and the buyer, the end user, whoever it was in our panel that described them as the only constant, I think it was John, I couldn't agree more. We all exist to serve the needs of the electricity consumer. Okay. Right? And I think we sometimes forget that. And so, I think we will see renewables become a dominant factor in the grid, and price between brown and green won't be the issue. The issue will simply be price in the marketplace.
Okay. All right. I've got one last question here, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about this before Dan gives me the hook on this. And this one comes from Joe Sullivan, who I think must live in a part of the country where I'm at, is the Southeast, and this is sort of rolling the grenade in the room, guys. And the question is, what will it take for the Southeast to hitch to the renewable energy train, and what are the consequences if we don't do it? That's to everybody.
That's a great question. I like the question.
While you're thinking about that,
Yeah.
this relates back to the day PKD, when the president or the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who you know I'm talking about, tried to push standard market design across all of the wholesale markets, and largely because of one integrated utility company in the Southeast here, he no longer had a job.
So Ross,
will-
to answer that question, I think actually I'll take a stab at it because I've spent some time looking at it. Let's start with wind. If you take your hub height from 80 meters to 110 meters, much of the southeastern part of the United States, which is not cost effective for wind development today, becomes so. Because once you're up higher, you access better aeolian currents, and therefore your levelized cost of energy fall within your prerequisites to be cost effective. You're also seeing a steady march of solar. Florida already is saturated with solar. FPL and Gulf Power, et cetera, are doing a whole ton. Now we're starting to see solar going into places like Duke in very large amounts, because the reality is renewables are now becoming the most cost-effective generating resource on the planet, bar none. So if one pushes back against those things, either because one has made inappropriate long-term bets on fossil and you don't want to get rid of your stranded assets because you're bearing those costs, one way or the other, a couple of things are going to happen. You're going to disadvantage your ratepayers or your customers because you're not accessing the lowest cost power. The second thing is carbon pricing in some way, shape, or form is inevitable. It's already being introduced by the Biden administration for the social cost of carbon. It's already being discussed in New York ISO New England and PJM are looking at it, and FERC has discussed pricing carbon into wholesale markets. Now, the Southeast still doesn't play in those markets, but ultimately they will be dragged kicking or screaming into this decarbonized economy, and it would be better to be proactive, and some of them are starting to now move in that direction. I don't know if you saw the comments from Edison Institute, Thomas Kuhn, the other day. He said it is feasible to decarbonize the power grid, and we will do it. So to me, the game is already a foregone conclusion. If you fast forward 20 or 30 years, we already know what's going to happen. It's just whether you're going to be smart and make money or stupid and lose money. It's a pretty simple equation at the end of the day at a macro level.
Okay, Dan, I think we have expended our time, unless you want to give us a few more minutes. Dan, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Take a few more minutes.
Eric, go ahead.
I'll just add to what PKD said. I think the Southeast has always been a world unto itself when it comes to power generation. We've seen some, some adoption there on the natural gas side to create some form of competitive market in places around natural gas. I think it's inevitable that they'll move in that direction with electricity. But what's going to take to make it happen, I think, is for the buyer community to make their voices heard and to bring the same kind of pressure to the dominant players in that marketplace to be responsive to not only sustainability-based objectives around renewable energy, but also choice-based objectives around don't force feed me, how I'm supposed to consume renewable energy. Let me figure it out. Give me a path that allows me to make choices. And I think that, there's a reason why we've seen such dramatic differences in the adoption rate in competitive electricity markets as it relates to renewables than you do in non-competitive electricity markets, for the most part. And so I think the Southeast is going to have to come to grips with that. And it's not going to happen without a push from the regulators. The regulators aren't going to be pushed unless it comes from the voters and the public.
Right. Okay.
Ross,
Thank you. Anybody?
I would
John?
I would add a little bit of flavor flavor to that is that the reality of it is that a fear is what's kept a lot of this innovation before renewables became the issue. A lot of the innovation around your demand response initiatives, your grid interaction initiatives, a lot of the things that are just not coming to pass as this is how the marketplace is going to evolve. Those journeys started years ago, okay? And the utilities resisted those because they were threatened, okay? They didn't understand how their business model was going to be able to embrace those changes. Okay, so I would argue that that is a big piece of what you're going to have with the renewables in terms of, okay, how can the embedded utilities, which are a necessary element, they have to be there, and they want to, their world is one of just, repetitive predictability. How are they going to deal with this transition and make money? Okay, so that's where they're wrestling right now is that, how do they really embrace this without putting a big gun to their head? And they're creatures of incredible habit, right? Is that so? What I would say is that it's going to take a little time. I don't think it's going to take as much time as everybody thinks, okay? Because the world is changing exponentially now instead of linearly. But it's going to change, and they're going to be forced to embrace and then figure out how that their models are going to continue to work because we need them to be sustainable. Okay, but how exactly that it can work if it's a deregulated environment that they end up with on the energy side, it's going to be interesting. But I wouldn't put anything past this transformation in terms of what the game looks like for even these heavily embedded regulated markets that traditionally could control this, because I don't think it's going to be controllable.
Great, thank you, John. Dan, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. That was a fantastic session. Very, very, very interesting. Very interesting indeed. That's all I can say. I enjoyed it very much.
Yep.
But anyway, appreciate your time. And again, want to thank you for your contribution to the program. If anybody has questions and would like to stay in touch with the panelists, just let me know, and I'm happy to facilitate an introduction and a connection there. And look forward to having you guys again in our next show to give an update on this. I think yeah, it's an extremely fast-moving area, and one that that we need to definitely stay abreast of. So with that, we're going to take a half-an-hour break before the next session on the role of smart buildings and municipalities in achieving 100% renewable energy. So that'll be held in the same room as with the other sessions. And so again, half-hour break, and we'll reconvene at that time. And I'm going to publish the links again in the chat room so that you can see where to access the attendee list and the feedback form and the PDFs of all the presentations. So thanks again, guys, for a great session.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, everybody.